Oh, have any of you have seen the study guide for the next pass? It was placed on iCollege Tuesday around 11 last Tuesday. So it's been there a few days, but you have a couple of weeks notice. The Pass 3 study guide is on iCollege. Pass 3 will consist of 12 questions, which I think are cause and effect. You know, this person saw this. How did he react? Well, one question. I mean, this is on the pass. Cortez heard a bunch of hideous screams coming from Montezuma's temple. All right, what did you do about it? That's in the book, but later it's also on the pass, and I will be discussing that a little bit later. When he heard it, when he heard the screams, he was told by his interpreter that these were people who were being sacrificed to the sun god. Cortez's sensibilities were just simply blown, I mean, to say the least. All right, how he reacted, read it for yourself. All right. City of Rome is located halfway down the western coast of Italy. It is not located on the seacoast. It's located on the Tiber River, about 50 miles from the coast. And probably the reason for this is, in those days, there were a whole lot of tidal waves, and it's believed that a tidal wave might have completely wiped out the island of Crete. And they were having a whole lot of earthquakes and tidal waves in those days, so Rome located itself, yes, along the river, but it was also located on 7 hills, so it's known by 2 nicknames, the City of 7 Hills, number 1, and it's also known as the Eternal City. Italy, Rome was an ideal port because being along the river, that meant it was protected not only from tidal waves, but from strong winds, and also from pirates. Very few pirates would venture 50 miles up a river to attack the city's shipping and then go back down because they ran a risk of being trapped by a fleet. Pirates like to have a wide open space where they can run in all directions. So it was difficult for pirates. But the fact it was on 7 hills meant it was easy to defend. I mean, even today, there's soldiers standing on top of a hill and shooting at the enemy who's down below. The ones on the top have an advantage. They can see farther for one thing. Bullets travel farther downhill, and so do arrows. And even fighting hand to hand, the person who's above has an easier time fighting than a person who's down below looking up, trying to swing at a person who's higher up than he is. So they had the advantage of being on top of hills. Where Rome is located is a shallow part of the Tiber River, which meant that it was easy to get across and easy to build bridges across it. Rome was more or less centrally located also. I said it was halfway up the peninsula. That makes it centrally located and made it an ideal place for the city to become the master of all of Italy. Now, Rome's history, the first 200 years or so of Rome's history is not believed by a lot of historians. According to tradition, Rome was founded by 2 twin boys named Romulus and Remus. And this was a common occurrence in those days. Their parents did not want them, so when they were born, their parents sent them out to the woods where a she-wolf found them, and a she-wolf reared them up. Now, folk, we have about 50 documented cases of this kind of thing happening. I mean, well documented. We know that there are occasions where the wolves have taken in human babies into their culture. And when these humans are found, oftentimes at the age of 5, 6, 7, or 8, they seem to be no worse off for having spent their first 5 or 6 years of their life among the wolves. You know, Romulus and Remus were brought up by wolves, according to tradition, and Nearby here is a town of Rome, Georgia. And if you ever visit Rome, in the city square, they have a statue of a she-wolf nurturing two twin baby boys. By any chance, have any of you seen it? I get the same response every time I ask the question. I used to live in Calhoun, so I used to visit Rome pretty often. Rome, Georgia, that is. Anyway, Rome, Georgia was named after Rome, Italy. According to tradition, when Romulus and Remus grew up, they got into a fight. Romulus killed Remus, and that's why the city of Rome is named Rome after Romulus. Now, according to tradition, Rome was first ruled by 7 kings, one after another, and each of these kings lived to be an old man and reigned a long time. For a long time, we looked on these kings as being actually historical, but then came the historian Gibbon, who said, "No, wait a minute. We don't have an original source about these kings. All we have is secondary sources." So he said, "I don't believe any of these 7 kings actually existed." But time has gone on. Today we do have some original sources. We know that the last 3 of these kings actually existed, actually lived, and actually ruled. All right, now here's a part of the story that takes somewhat of a modern twist. The last king was deposed by a popular uprising, and Rome developed something that resembles a democracy, but they call it a republic. In effect, they had no king, no emperor. They would elect some top officers, and these officers had to stand up for re-election every once in a while. In other words, they picked their leaders as they needed to. Well, time went on under the Republic. Now, I want to jump ahead of the story a little bit about Rome's Republic. The Greeks had a form of democracy, particularly Athens. The democracy failed. Rome's Republic also failed. The Greek philosophers, Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, were really hard against democracy. And when Rome's democracy failed, democracy was to get a bad name that it was not able to live down for more than 1,000 years. It was to be more than 1,000 years before the British tried a form of democracy. But anyway, Rome tried a form of democracy that lasted a few hundred years. And under their republic, they conquered all of Italy. Here's how, to make a long story short. They would engage in a war with the city-state nearby, and they would win. But instead of enslaving that city-state, they'd tell them, "Hey, we're going to build a road from our city to yours. You be our ally. We'll protect you from your enemies, and in turn we expect you to protect us from our enemies. Your sons are welcome to marry our daughters, and we're willing to give our daughters to your sons in marriage. Come and join us." So the Romans would get to work at building a road. And after a while there came a saying, "All roads lead to Rome." And a lot of the roads that they built with a firm foundation and of solid rock. A lot of these roads are still in use today, even in these days of automobiles. Now your big 18-wheelers, granted, 18-wheeler can't get on them, but your ordinary automobiles can still travel these roads. That some of them are still in service. Well, Rome would conquer one city after another, get them on their side, and use these combined cities as a springboard to conquer other cities, until after a while, they had all of Italy. They began to build forts around various places in Italy for their own protection and for the protection of the people they conquered. And after a while, again, they had a firm foothold on Italy. All right. Under the Republic, they would appoint 2 consuls. They didn't want to have one man to become too strong. These consuls had equal power, and nothing could be done unless both consuls agreed together. Each consul could stop the other. The consuls were expected to govern Rome and lead armies, and see to the administration of justice. they also had a Senate. The Senate, now this is where we get, in the United States, get our Senate. A lot of what we read about in Rome, the United States copied. For instance, one thing Rome had was domes for their capital, and almost every state capital now is under a dome, including the federal capital in Washington, the state capital here in Atlanta. So most state capitals are domed just like they were in Roman times. The Senate consists of 300 men, but unlike in our system, the senators were appointed for life. Most of the time, the senators came from the aristocratic class, the upper classes. Eventually, though, the classes came into conflict. Your upper classes, the patricians, came into conflict with the lower class and the plebeians. Now, if you read anything about Karl Marx will tell you that all of history is a class warfare between working class and rich class, between the rich and poor. No, not all of history, I'll say, but part of history is a class conflict. The plebeians were needed, though, to help Rome fight its wars. So eventually, the patricians said up to the plebeians, I'll tell you what, you appoint 2 men called tribunes, and we'll give you these tribunes veto power. Yeah, there were 2 men. They had the power to veto. No, the tribunes did not make laws and did not vote on laws, but if the tribunes did not like a law that was passed by the patricians, they simply could veto the law and say, no, we will not tolerate this law is not going to books. And they gave these tribunes this veto power. Eventually, the wars between the classes lessened when laws were passed that said that the patrician class could marry plebeians and vice versa. Plebeians could marry patricians. And eventually the class wars, they were somewhat lessened. Now, Rome had been successful at winning its wars in Italy until they were masters of all of Italy. And Rome conquered the known world in 3 stages. First, they conquered Italy, then they conquered the Western Mediterranean, then they conquered the Eastern Mediterranean. That's throwing a lot at you at once. But they ran into conflict with a big city here called Carthage. Carthage had been started by the Phoenicians, who lived over here next to Israel. And Carthage had grown, and Carthage was the gateway to all of Africa. And if you know anything about African history, we'll talk about Africa later. Africa has more resources than any other continent in the world. And even in these olden times, they recognize it. So the trade that went to Africa, went from Africa or to Africa, would drop off at Carthage. And so Carthage became quite wealthy. Well, Carthage claimed the island of Sicily, and if you know anything about the Italian geography, it looks like Italy is a woman with a high-heeled shoe. Looks like this woman is kicking Sicily. In other words, it was close. The first war was fought over Sicily. All right, these wars were called the Punic Wars. The Punic Wars were destined to last 100 years. There were 3 of them, all told. Now we're not going to go into much detail about all 3 of them. But now in the case of Carthage, the Romans could not placate them. Now throughout its history, most of the people Rome conquered after a while accepted Rome's leadership, but there were 3 people that Rome encountered they could never placate, or they could never get on their side. One of them was Carthage, another one was the Jews. Rome and the Jews never really got along. And the other one was the British. Being of British descent, the Romans and the British did not get along very well either. And finally Rome gave up on Britain and let Britain go. But Rome took the Jews and said, leave Judea and don't come back, and the Jews were scattered for some 1900 years. But in the case of Carthage, the people of Carthage would not quit fighting. The first war was fought over Sicily. It ended with a victory for Rome. The Second Punic War was fought over Spain. And the Second Punic War produced a leader called Hannibal. Hannibal went into Italy by going through the back door. He got into southern France, which at this time was not owned by Rome, crossed the Swiss Alps with a herd of elephants, and that took some doing. But then once in Italy, he ravaged Italy for 20 years. He was smart enough and fast enough to where he never engaged the Romans in a decisive battle. He always managed to outrun them. He could move faster than the Roman armies could. That meant he only gave battle when he chose to give battle. When he didn't choose, he wouldn't. This was to go on for 20 years. And finally, though, a Roman general decided, I know what I'll do. I'm going to take the fight to Carthage. So this Roman general got his army, the general named Scipio, got his army, went to Carthage, and forced Hannibal to go to Carthage himself. And finally, Hannibal had to face the Roman armies head on. And the Roman armies were bigger than his. When Hannibal was defeated, Hannibal was sent to exile way down in Africa. Hannibal eventually escaped exile, went to Greece, tried to organize more fights against Rome. To no avail. Hannibal died defeated. Well, 50 years went by after the Second Punic War. Again, these were people who would not quit. We run into that sometimes. I'm going to digress a little bit. In our own history, American history, the Japanese. The Japanese fought hard and fought well. But when their emperor told them to stop fighting, all the Japanese quit fighting, and they have quit fighting to this day. The war was over. And the American Indians fought really hard. But when the American Indians saw they couldn't win, they quit fighting. During the Civil War, the Confederacy, they fought bravely, they fought hard. They actually probably fought harder than the Union, but they were outnumbered. When they saw they couldn't win, they surrendered and they quit fighting. The Germans, we fought them twice, but finally they surrendered for good, and for the last 70 years they have quit fighting. But there's some people who will not quit fighting yet. They won't quit, they won't quit. Carthage was that way. At the end of the Third Punic War, the Romans went into the city of Carthage, burnt the city to the ground, sold all of its inhabitants into slavery, and plowed up the ground with salt to where it would not be productive again. And that was, for the most part, the end of Carthage. Some people did move back into Carthage. You can read about it if you do a study in Carthage's history. Some people did move back in, but that never amounted to anything. For all practical purposes, the Punic Wars are over. Again, Rome did what it felt it had to do, completely displaced the people of Carthage, could not make allies of them, could not get them on their side. And Rome then claimed all of North Africa and Spain, all the territory that Carthage had claimed, Rome claimed. Now, Rome did not yet have Gaul or France. That was to come later. But Rome at this point had North Africa, had all of Italy, and that was today's Spain. And they were yet to get the rest of the world. All right. When it appeared that Rome was going to take the whole world, a king here in Pergamum, which was part of Turkey, when he died, he did not will his crown to his sons, but instead he willed his crown to Rome, figuring Rome was going to get it anyway. It looked like Rome was destined to conquer the world. However, some things began to go on and undermine the republic. During the wars, the generals took on a tremendous amount of power. The Senate began to take on more and more powers. Now, folk, those of you who are versed in American history, maybe most of you are not, we have a written constitution that supposedly tells you what powers each office holds: the office of president, the office of representative, the office of senate. But occasionally, someone will take an office and will abuse the power of that office and make the office more powerful than it ought to be. And in our own country's history, the worst case scenario is our Supreme Court. Their decisions have not been overturned in 100 years. Now, if that doesn't sound like checks and balances to you, it doesn't to me either. The last time the decision was overturned was an income tax law was passed. The Supreme Court ruled it unconstitutional, so a constitutional amendment was passed and made it the income tax legal. That occurred in 1912, 1913, thereabouts, folk, more than 100 years ago. Otherwise, their decisions simply cannot be overturned. They were not given the power of judicial review in the Constitution. They usurped it. All right, so much for that. Now, in Roman times, a lot of times senators would usurp the power. The Rome did not have a constitution that defined how much power each office had. It would be like having an army where that some captains would have more men than some majors would, and some majors might even have more men than some colonels, but where that an office, a rank was not defined. It basically a man would be given a rank, but how much power he would wield would depend on his force of personality, or how many men he could get on his side. Basically, one of the problems they had was they did not define what an office was and what kind of powers this office had and the limitations of the office. And also, in time of war, with all respect, you may not realize, during the Civil War, both Abraham Lincoln of the Union and Jefferson Davis of the Confederacy ruled like kings. Abraham Lincoln put people in jail without reason, without due process. He denied the writ of habeas corpus, which says you have to give a reason for why you are doing what you're doing. Again, our democracy was somewhat suspended. We still held elections, and the representatives and senators were still elected. Jefferson Davis did the same thing. Free speech was curtailed. In World War I, President Woodrow Wilson jailed a whole lot of dissenters. Free speech was curtailed in World War II also by both sides. Winston Churchill curtailed free speech in Britain, and of course Hitler never allowed free speech in Germany. War, you do what you have to do to win. If you don't, oftentimes you lose. We curtailed free speech and we won World War I. We curtailed free speech and won World War II. We allowed free speech in the Vietnam War and we lost. Anyway, what I'm getting at is the Roman Republic fell when some of Rome's powerful generals, particularly Marius and Sulla, they began to recruit from anybody, including people who were not Roman. It would be like one of our generals might decide, I'm going to take in Mexican Americans, and another general, I'm going to take in Brazilians, and then basically they began to recruit from wherever they could. In addition, but basically the generals started making their soldiers swear an oath of loyalty to them and not their country. Now, folks, when I joined the Army many years ago, I put one hand on the Bible and raised my other hand toward heaven, and I swore to defend the United States. But now, what if I would have sworn to defend President Jimmy Carter, who was president at that time? That would have set a dangerous precedent. I mean, we have not allowed that yet, but the generals had those troops swear loyalty to them, not to Rome. But also, the wars would last for years, and a soldier might be gone, not just like a local campaign where a soldier would travel for a few months and come back in wintertime. He'd be gone for years and come back and find his wife had been unable to keep up the farm and had sold the farm because she couldn't keep it. He'd find his farm sold. Oftentimes a soldier would come home wounded and broken up. A lot of soldiers come home mentally suffering from what's called combat fatigue, or in modern terms they call it shell-shocked, or wounded physically as well as mentally. And make long story short, a lot of soldiers lost their farms, lost their occupations. Family life was weakened. And then, yes, a lot of soldiers would come home and find their wives and marry other men. I mean, this happens in every war. Family life was greatly weakened. And the land began to find its way into the hands of a few wealthy people, which is a problem that has been true throughout all of history. Well, into this scenario step two brothers, the Gracchus brothers. His brother Gaius. These two men go down in history as heroes, even though I will tell you right up front, before we start, I disagree with what they were trying to do. But Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus noticed that, hey, there's a big income inequity here in Rome. The rich have almost all the land, and the poor have none. So he went before the Roman Senate. He himself was a senator. And he said to the Senate, I think we ought to take lands that are not being used, but lands that are owned by a few rich folk, and redistribute these lands among the poor people. May sound to you like a great idea. Well, the senators got together and they assassinated Tiberius Gracchus. I mean, this is the way politics was conducted under the Roman Republic. Well, Tiberius' younger brother Gaius took up the issue, and he thought, well, you know, they won't happen to me. Those people were punished. So he said, I think that public lands that are not being used by anyone, should be redistributed among the poor people. He also was assassinated. Now, I do admire the courage of these men. They were martyrs. They died for what they believed. What they did not realize was that redistribution of wealth has never worked anywhere where it's been tried. People who are just handed wealth will almost always lose it as quickly as they got it. Why is that? I'm not even sure I know how to answer that. But you take wealth from the rich, redistribute that wealth among the poor, and eventually your whole society goes down the tubes. And we have seen that happen time after time in the 20th century. France has tried to experiment with socialism, and their experiment has failed. But we have not in America learned our lessons, so we're trying to experiment socialism ourselves, and I can pretty well guarantee you it will fail. Socialism destroys incentive. If you feel like, hey, I'm going to get paid whether I work or not. The North American Indians, you might not realize it, but their problem was they were communistic. They lived in communes, so we call them villages, but they lived in communes, and everybody got fed. The hard-working, productive got fed, and the lazy and non-productive got fed also. Everybody got fed, and the result was their culture went down to rock bottom. When our country was started, Captain John Smith said to the Virginians, a bunch of Virginian men said, we are gentlemen, we don't work. He said, he who will not work will not eat. And the men in our country got to work. Hey, that sounds cruel. You mean you let people who don't work starve to death? All right, I'll let you figure that one out. The alternative is for everybody to go down in tubes in a pile. Otherwise, you let some people feed themselves, learn how to feed themselves, while others either decide to learn how to feed themselves or let them starve. That sounds cold, that sounds harsh, that sounds cruel, I know. And basically, I disagree with what the Gracchus brothers were just trying to decide to do. No, I don't agree that they should have been killed for what they said. All right. Marius and Sulla, two generals they got so much influence because of their victories that after a while they both felt like they could take over. They fought a civil war with each other in which Sulla defeated Marius, and Marius was killed, and Sulla then took over. But again, when Sulla won, he didn't just give the power back to Senate. He won and said, okay, now folk, I got something to tell you. I'm in charge here and I expect my orders to be obeyed. Basically, he took over as a dictator. The Roman democracy, or the Roman Republic, I should say, was not yet dead. This set the example. Sulla died, and for the next 50 years, the leadership in Rome passed to whoever could win the most fights. Basically, it was a matter of the men would, you might say, get their armies together, and whoever had the biggest army or the best army would win, and he'd become dictator until someone came along with another army. Now, can you imagine a country, in our country, where that Donald Trump would have his own army, Ted Turner would have his army, and well, I mean, some other rich tycoon would have their own army, and maybe Hillary Clinton would have his army. I mean, each one would have their own armies. Then once in a while, some of these armies would start fighting. This was what Rome was like for the next 50 or so years. The idea that only the state should have an army was to come later, when they realized letting individuals have armies was just simply a shortcut road to civil war. But eventually, you had three men who got together with as the most powerful men in Rome: Crassus, Pompey, and Julius. Well, Crassus was sent east. He was the richest man in Rome, but he was sent to try to conquer the east, and his army succeeded in conquering the east, but of course, of the battle, he died. So Crassus was killed. That left Pompey and Julius. Well, Pompey went off to Spain to settle a dispute in Spain. In the meantime, Julius went to, they called it Gaul, to France. We now know him as Julius Caesar. But Julius Caesar, Julius, when he went to France, he sent back a note, and it has three Latin words, and I cannot pronounce it in Latin, but basically it was, I came, I saw, I conquered. Weenie, weenie, witchy, or something like that. Don't quote me on that. If any of you know Latin and can pronounce it better than I did, you're welcome to. I've had some people in a class who claimed that their pronunciations were better than mine. But basically, it's the three words: I came, I saw, I conquered. Well, Julius Caesar now was very, very powerful here in Gaul, or in France. So Rome now had Spain, had France, and had all of North Africa, except Egypt, and was beginning to make some inroads in conquering the East. They had also conquered Greece, so the Roman Empire was at this point quite large. And the Romans began to fear Julius Caesar. So they told Julius Caesar, lay down your arms, go back to your estate, and retire. Julius Caesar had to make a decision. He told his men, I'm not going to lay down my arms, instead let us march. So when the men marched, when they crossed a wooden bridge, or those days all the bridges were made of wood, he'd tell his men, all right, the last of you, when you cross, turn around and burn your bridges. Burn the bridge. That led to this saying, we're going to burn our bridges behind us. That means we're either going to conquer Rome or we're going to die trying, but we're not going to go back. The man I referred to earlier, Hernando Cortez, did the same thing when he went to Mexico. He went to Mexico and told the men, all right, let's burn all of our ships. We're either going to conquer Mexico or we're going to die trying, but we're not going to retreat. Well, Julius Caesar went into to Italy. The Romans sent Pompey to fight with him. Julius Caesar defeated Pompey, and for all practical purposes, the Republic was then over. Julius Caesar was made dictator, and a few years later he took the title of dictator for life, and with that there was no Roman Republic anymore. Now folk, a lot of time, particularly in my own lifetime, democracies have failed when a strong man takes over. In the Philippines, right after World War II, we gave the Philippines their independence. Under democracy, the Philippines were headed for chaos. A strong man took over named Marcos, and order was restored. Singapore tried democracy, it didn't work. Liu Yan took over Singapore, and after a while, order was restored. Time and time again, nations would try democracy, and for the most part, it did not work. And eventually, a strong man would take over. This was what happened in Rome. Now, once Caesar was in power, he married Cleopatra, the last of the pharaohs of Egypt. Again, for the most part, Egypt didn't have female rulers, but in this case, Cleopatra had managed to inherit the throne by first pretending her brother was the pharaoh, and then she set aside her younger brother and she took over. Then, to make sure that she had completely confirmed her power, she married Julius Caesar, and that way she pretty well guaranteed that she was going to be in charge of Egypt. Julius Caesar and Cleopatra had one son who never got to be Caesar. Instead, while the son was still an infant, Julius Caesar was assassinated. There was a story that used to be in your book, and if any of you have some of the older books, this story is still in them, but the authors finally took it out. The story that Julius Caesar was going to the Senate one day, and on the way there was this blind soothsayer who sat by the side of the Senate door begging. This blind soothsayer said, "On the Ides of March, you're going to die." If you look up the Ides of March, there's nothing significant about it except that Julius Caesar died on that day. The Ides of March, by the way, is the 15th day of March. The only thing significant about it is, like I said, Julius Caesar died that day. But anyway, a few days went by and the Ides of March came, and Julius Caesar went to the Senate again, and he saw this blind soothsayer, and he said, "It's the Ides of March, and I'm still here." The blind soothsayer said, "The Ides of March are not over with yet." What Julius Caesar did not know was that 24 senators had conspired to kill him, and these 24 senators had daggers under their cloaks, and that's where we get the term cloak and dagger. And they all had practiced this for some time. They said, "Now, whoever he is, 4 of you get in front of him. 6 of you get in front of him. 6 of you get on his right," and they all knew which ones to get on his right hand. 6 of you on his left, and 6 of you get on his rear. But pretend to be engaged in conversation with anyone, not just each other, but anyone in particular. And when I, your leader, say a certain word, you all pull out your daggers. So they were all casually engaging in some talk around the Senate, and the 24 men positioned themselves as they planned, some in front, some in back, some on his right, some on his left. When the leader gave a certain word, all 24 men pulled out their daggers and lunged for Julius. Julius Caesar looked around and noticed that the man he thought was his friend Brutus, he said, "Et tu, Brute," which was Latin for "you too, Brutus," his last words. Then he just simply resigned himself to his fate. Julius Caesar's friends could do absolutely nothing to help because they were unarmed. Julius Caesar was killed by some 40 stab wounds. Cleopatra fled. Cleopatra united herself with Mark Antony, thinking he would be the winner, but she picked the wrong man. Instead, the Roman people rallied around, a lot of them rallied around Octavian, whom we know of as Caesar Augustus. Octavian and Mark Antony fought a civil war. And Octavian won. Mark Antony died. Cleopatra used a venomous snake to kill herself with because she believed that this venomous snake, people who died at the hands of a venomous snake became a god. and she believed she'd become a goddess if she, for also having been Pharaoh, that guaranteed her position in the Godhead. No. There was a movie made about this. If any of you happen to see it, called Cleopatra, made around 1962, starred Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton. Those names may mean nothing to most of you, but they were the most famous actors and actresses of their day. Did any of you happen to see it? I did. Anyway, there was a movie made about it. Anyway, Caesar Augustus, with him, for all practical purposes, the Republic was over, but Caesar Augustus was terrified that he might someday be assassinated also. So he made a pretense that the Republic was still going on. When he went to the Senate, he sat in the Senate along with everybody else. He did not sit at the head of the Senate, but he sat in a seat and let somebody else take charge, make it look like somebody else was actually governing. But for all practical purposes, he was dictator. He organized the Praetorian Guard to keep from happening to him what had happened to Julius. Praetorian Guard was what we might call the secret service of their day. These Praetorian Guards were armed, and they even followed Caesar Augustus went into the Senate. Caesar Augustus ruled for 45 years. And finally, the civil wars, finally under him, they came to an end. Caesar Augustus was the Caesar when Jesus was born, even though he probably was not aware of it. He made a really, really huge mistake, though. When the wars were over, a lot of the soldiers came home and found their farms gone, sold. They were idle. That is, they had nothing to do. Every once in a while, these idle poor people would break out and riot, or they would set fires. And Caesar Augustus had to deal with them. What should he do about these? So he decided he would feed them from the state treasury. And it was called bread and circuses. Basically, he would give them food and entertainment. And folk, there have been more than one person who has said our modern day Americans' love for sports and our food stamp programs and government handout programs are harking back to Caesar Augustus' days of bread and circuses. Keep these people fed and keep them entertained and they'll be happy. And among the circuses were not just circuses, but they were gladiatorial shows where the two gladiators would actually fight, and usually one of them would kill the other. I mean, they'd fight with bare swords, and until one of them had subdued the other. The audience would decide whether they wanted the winner to kill the other or not. Thumbs up meant spare the loser. Thumbs down meant the winner was expected to kill the loser. This was to go on for a few hundred years. Well, the lower class had lost all their political power and influence at this point. They were no longer interested in politics as long as they were given food or entertainment. Also, the people of Rome, all right, folks, now, it has been said that peace is actually mankind's worst enemy. War is terrible, but when the war is over with, the people will come back and rebuild what's been destroyed, and they will oftentimes come back and have a lot of babies, and oftentimes name the babies after a fallen relative. I mean, hey, I was a war baby from World War II. My father before me was a war baby from World War I. After World War I, there were a lot of babies born. After World War II, we had what's called a baby boom generation. In peacetime, people will tend to get soft and lazy. The Romans, now that the wars were over, they were getting these big, expensive parties. They'd eat and drink all night. Now, folks, if this sounds gross, I'm sorry. I'm going to tell you, regurgitate what they eat, go to the train, regurgitate, and then go back and eat some more, go back and regurgitate what they eat, and they could keep doing this for hours on end. It is known that this lifestyle shortened their lives greatly. Caesar Augustus and others became alarmed that, hey, our people who were once mighty and strong have now become weak and soft. So he tried to pass laws to stem the downward trend. not realizing he actually encouraged a downward trend by giving away bread in circuses. But he passed laws to try to stem the downward trend. He outlawed adultery, outlawed pornography, tried to restore old standard morality. He taxed single, unmarried people, men and women, heavily. And he gave tax exemptions to people who had children, all in an attempt to encourage people to have more children. But the result was, over time, the laws that he passed had little effect. The Roman population continued to go down and down and down some more. There was a high number of bachelors and a high number of unmarried women. Caesar Augustus did try to conquer Germany and lost. And he was known to go around the palace just weeping, saying, "Oh, give me back my army." His army they sent to Germany was completely annihilated from the generals to the privates and never returned. And he would just be crying for his lost army. He passed a law that Germany was never to be conquered. Later, Caesar broke that law and partially conquered Germany. But folk, as I said, maybe to this class once again, the people you don't conquer will oftentimes rise up and conquer you. And eventually, Germany was to conquer Rome. All right. When Caesar Augustus died, another Caesar took over, Tiberius. And for all, Tiberius was an adopted son, just like Caesar Augustus had been an adopted son of Julius Caesar. Tiberius was an adopted son of Caesar Augustus. What these emperors tended to do, now not all of them, but a bunch of them would adopt a son who had looked like he was the most intelligent, most promising young man among the nobility. He would adopt his son and groom that son to be the next emperor. And then when he died, turn over the empire to that son. And this way, here's the problem. A lot of these men knew that their own biological sons simply would not make good emperors. And they said, "No, my biological son is not smart enough, not wise enough, he'll never make a good emperor." So they would adopt someone who was, they felt like was better suited and make him the next emperor. In the course, though, of time, I mean, life oftentimes was short, even the upper classes. These members of the royal family would sometimes take up music and sometimes art. But there was one named Nero. Nero, as a young man, had taken up music and never thought he'd be emperor because he was the youngest son of the former emperor. But his older brothers all died off, and make a long story short, when the father died, they went and found Nero. He was hiding among the curtains, but they went and found him and said, "Hey, come on, you're the emperor." And it made Nero emperor. He had never wanted to be, never expected to be. It was said that the first time Nero signed an execution order, it was for a man who was leading an insurrection. Basically, it was a man who really deserved to be killed. I mean, all kings have to kill people who rise up against them. So Nero said, "You mean if I sign this order, you're going to kill this man?" They said, "Yes, yes, your majesty. This is what you're emperor now. This is what you must do as emperor. You've got to keep some kind of order, and some people have to be executed, and this man richly deserves it. I guarantee you, we have to execute him." Nero said, "Oh, I wish I had never learned to write," and signed his name to the execution order. That's ironic because later on Nero was signing execution orders without even a thought, without even a twang of conscience about it anymore. Well, a big fire occurred in Rome. There have been many accounts. I mean, we can't tell today who started it. Nero blamed the fire on Christians. We don't know how it happened. Some say that Nero was fiddling while Rome burned, but some accounts say no, he actually was outside the city, and when he heard about the fire, he came back in and tried to direct the operation of putting it out. I mean, they needed a leader, and he was the emperor. But make a long story short, he blamed the fire on the Christians, and he began the first systematic persecution of Christians. But the people of Rome eventually rose up against him, and he committed suicide, and his last words were, "What an artist dies in me." Well, time went on. We had some good emperors and some bad. But you finally get to a group of men who ruled one after another, called the 5 good emperors. Five good emperors: Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antonius Pius, and Marcus Aurelius. These men were not father and son, they were father and adopted son. In other words, basically Nerva adopted Trajan, Trajan adopted Hadrian, Hadrian adopted Antonius Pius, and Antonius Pius adopted Marcus Aurelius. And each of these men then were groomed for the emperorship from the time they showed promise as being capable and intelligent. They all were capable, intelligent men. Under them, well, under Trajan, Trajan did conquer a lot of the German tribes. Under Hadrian, the empire reached its greatest extent around the year CE 117. These men built aqueducts. Aqueducts would carry fresh water into a city, and some of these aqueducts that they built are still in service. The aqueduct would get water from a mountain stream and guide it to a city where it was needed. They built bridges, they built colosseums, built temples. They did a lot of public works projects, and yes, they built roads. Roads were important even in those days. A horse on a cart on a good road could pull a whole lot more than the same horse could on mud. The roads were made out of rock to where they would not mire down in mud in the wintertime. This was a period of peace and prosperity. Rome boasted of its Pax Romana. The Pax Romana was to last about 200 years, a period of Roman peace. Things were never better, but there were some bad things on the horizon. For one thing, the population was continuing to decline, and nothing seemingly could be done to stem the tide. Well, what was wrong with the population, basically, folk, it was simply this. The men and women did not like each other. Their women became completely corrupted. It was said their women would bounce around from one man to another, and one writer put it this way: he said, a young woman would marry, leave that man for another man, leave that man for a third man, and leave that one for a fourth, but oftentimes, much of the time, she would wind up, when all was said and done, back with her first husband, because she never found any contentment outside of her first husband, and she'd wind up back with her husband number one. And that's ironic. In the early days of the Roman Republic, and in the early days of Roman history, divorce was uncommon. Then divorce became really, really commonplace. And, catch this close, the rich were far more likely to divorce than were the poor. Does anything sound familiar today? I mean, Ted Turner, when his last wife left him, Jane Fonda by name, he said, I wish somebody could tell me how to make a marriage work. Maybe if you were poor like the rest of us, you might could find someone who would marry you for love and not for money. In our society, a lot of times, folks, we value 3 things in picking a marriage partner: looks, personality, and money. And I got some news for you. Not any one of those 3 have anything at all to do with making the marriage work. Just ask the people who have the looks and personality and money. Ted Turner is one example. Elizabeth Taylor, she's gone now, but she was another, married 8 times. Jane Fonda is another example. And I'll say Donald Trump is another example. Can't make a marriage work. Anyone have a comment? I mean, you've been probably, you're welcome to comment. Anyway, but Rome had a problem with divorce. very high incidence of it. And now, folk, I'm a little bit hesitant to say this, but I'm going to say it, and you can take it for whatever. The relationship between these men and the men who followed was a man-boy love relationship, basically a homosexual relationship. And I would also say that Julius Caesar got promoted to the rank he got in the army by a sexual liaison with a man who was the commanding officer at the time. This was oftentimes the way these men got ahead and got promoted. You can take that for whatever you want to. I mean, if you check the records carefully, like I have done, you'll find it's not in your book, but if you can find it is in the record. Now, with Marcus Aurelius, he has been the subject of more than one movie, including Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. If any of you have ever seen Marcus Aurelius in the movies by any chance at all? I guess none of you have, but he's been in several movies. Yes?
I'm sorry, what you said about the 5 emperors? Like how they had
Each one of them would pick the next successor.
Do we have to know that for the test, though?
No, this will not be on the test. This will not be. The names of the emperors, yes. Hey, if you see on a multiple choice test, 2 of the 5 good emperors, and you see Nero as one of the choices, pick another choice. Until Stalin, until Saddam Hussein, Nero went down in history as one of the worst rulers that anybody had ever had. The most cruel. But anyway, pick another one. But, anyway, with Marcus Aurelius, up until his time, Rome had been thriving. Then, under his administration, there came crop failures. There came big fires. There came storms. Now, you cannot prove it that far back, but a lot of people believe that Marcus Aurelius' day experienced a climate change, not in a form of a global warming, but the climate was cooling. Not only did the Roman Empire begin to suffer reverses here, but so did at the same time China and India. Now we're talking about the 200 years. In China, about this time, the Han Dynasty fell. Shortly after, not too long after, the Roman Empire itself fell. Now in the case of Marcus Aurelius, when he died, his biological son, Commodus, succeeded him. Commodus was almost as bad as Nero. Commodus took on 12 names and named all the months of the calendar after himself, after his 12 names. He set himself up to be worshipped as God while he was still alive, something the other emperors would only do when they died. The people finally rose up against him and killed him. And the people of Rome then put the office of empire for auction, sold it to the highest bidder. The man with the most money got the office. Very much, if you think that's disgraceful, they did too at the time. All right, now, folk, just by way of reminder, the spring break is going to be March 14th. I might have said March 7th last time, but if I did, I'll stand corrected. The spring break is March 14th. You're going to have to get your Greek history from listening to my lectures online. And I have no apologies for saying that. This is a hybrid class. The next test, we have this class. The next one will talk about Rome, the rise of Christianity, and the fall of the Roman Empire, why it fell. And then I hope to be able to review a little bit. That's March 29th, February 29th. And then on March 7th, we have our next test. And what I'm about to say does not apply to most of you, but some of you really need to get your grades up and need to get them up that end. The only thing I have to say is study, and study a little bit harder. Several of you can do it. The rest of you can also. Now, another thing too, the drop deadline is something like March 8th or March 9th, somewhere in there. If you feel like you just cannot keep up, that might be a solution.